In the darkness before dawn, Soraka opened his eyes. A knock at his door came a moment later. He sat up from his litter, untangling himself from the mess of limbs that had developed overnight. "What is it?" he said. "A runner from Ranakjara," Jarika's voice came through the door. "The undead conducted some attacks overnight." "Of course they attacked overnight," Soraka yawned as he reached for his garb. "It's not as if they sleep." There was probably more to it. Ranakjara didn't seem like an excitable idiot. In the corridor outside of the room, he found his escort awaiting him with a skinny Singh lad a few years shy of adulthood. He looked up at Soraka with wide eyes and swallowed. "Spit it out, kid," Jarika said. "The undead," the runner licked his lips. "They attacked." "I already said that." "Ranakjara is in the Great Hall," the runner gave them an insistent look. Was there some great need for secrecy? It wasn't as if the undead used spies. They followed the runner to the keep's Great Hall, where they found Ranakjara at the table with a half-dozen lords with a grim air about them. The map that had been unfurled over the table the previous afternoon was still there. A few of the markers that Soraka placed upon it had been adjusted. "Soraka," Ranakjara rose upon his approach. I'm still not sure if it's appropriate to address you as such." "Soraka is fine. My political station back home has little bearing on our current situation." He examined the map for a moment longer. The southwestern corner of the undead encirclement was under attack. "What did the warriors from the front say about this?" Soraka asked. "An amphibious assault," Ranakjara answered. "The undead came ashore not far behind the front lines. Our forces had sentries posted, I assume." "We did. However, the undead came out in force and they weren't interested in attacking the new lines that we drew up to resist them. That wasn't good. The undead had dropped all pretense of being a mindless horde and were now openly acting as an organized force that employed effective tactics against their opponents. Perhaps the sole upside was that tactical and strategic thinking incorporated elements of reason that could be interpreted and countered." "How recent is this information?" "Lupengau runners take roughly 2 hours to arrive from that far," Ranakjara replied. "If they sent them to report right away, it should have started about 4.5 hours ago." "What are our losses so far?" "The clan station there had roughly 20,000 Osalo warriors. We're not sure how many are still fighting. The clans nearby are trying to assist, but the undead dividing them are holding their ground." "Shall I take a look?" The sacred claw in his escort spoke up. "How are you for mana?" Soraka asked. "About 2/3 full," the sacred claw answered. Soraka's claws tapped on the stone table as he stared down at the beleaguered position. A conventional army division in the Beastman Confederacy's armed forces usually had 2 companies of divination specialists that conducted reconnaissance and information warfare. Here, it felt like the dozen divine casters in his entourage were being tasked with an entire army group's worth of work. Was it worth checking? He could already imagine what would happen if the undead ambushed an unsuspecting division from the river in force. "Did you investigate the use of ritual magic?" "Yes," the sacred claw replied. "We asked while we were going around instructing the local mystics. None of the clans appear to be familiar with its use, just as it was in the East." "I see. Well, let's take a look. Make sure you conserve your mana accordingly after this. Even a standard thing like ritual magic is missing here." Pretty much every magic caster in the Central Powers could participate in ritual magic, or circle magic as it was more commonly called. It was an invaluable tool for maintaining liquidity in complex mana economies. Not everyone had the capacity to become a powerful magic caster, but every magic caster could learn how to participate in circle magic. By doing so, they made their mana available to the leader of any circle that they participated in, meaning that powerful magic casters could tap into the collective mana of the entire caster population instead of being limited to their personal mana pools. The Confederacy's most powerful casters never ran out of mana so long as there were other casters around with mana. Of course, that didn't apply in Rolengork, where the local caster population had no idea what circle magic was. The sacred claw completed her spell and started moving her scrying sensor around the area indicated on the map. Soraka's lips drew back in a snarl and a low growl filled his throat at the projection in the water. Osalo corpses were strewn across the landscape. A number of elder liches could be seen here and there organizing the bodies like quartermasters might arrange supplies. No signs of continued resistance could be seen. It was a place of the dead and the undead. At least he had managed to convince the clan lords to move the humans beforehand. The sensor moved eastward, following the highway along the river. A sigh filled the air as the sacred claw stopped at a line of piled corpses that seemed to extend to the horizon. Just past that line was the new position of the undead encirclement. "I don't understand," Ranakshara breathed. "How could our defeat be so complete?" "This is the true power of the enemy that we face," Saraka told him as he updated the markers on the map. "It is as I said yesterday, the undead have been playing us all for fools. They could have done this at any time during their advance. Then why did they even bother with this deception?" To understand that, one must first understand the nature of the undead. They are akin to a primal force that thrives off of everything that we, the living, abhor. Negative actions and emotions, suffering, decay, death. There is a list of very specific things that would probably take a day or two to recite. The undead do not only inflict negative physical conditions upon their victims, but they can also inflict negative mental states upon entire populations. This downward stance that they assumed from the beginning was the optimal method of generating what they desire, which is the propagation of negative energy. I believe that your mystics should have some knowledge on that topic. Negative energy? Ranakshara said, yes. But the way they treat it is more a matter of conservation, ensuring that our actions don't taint the land. I see. So what these undead are doing is the reverse. Exactly, Saraka nodded. But that stance only worked up until this point. One might argue it stopped fully working when they ran into Clan Toraka. Now, however, the will that drives these undead understands that their old approach will not work on Rolengork's defenders. I see what you mean now by being played. Everything so far has gone the way that the undead have wished, and we have been ignorant of it the entire time, making them stronger with each passing hour. But, how do we fight this? Their physical might aside, you imply that even our mental state can empower the undead. We all have our fears. Fear is what often keeps us alive. How can we not hate what is the foe of all life? I see these images in the water and I am already compelled to strike them down with all of my might. It's not wrong to feel that way, Saraka replied. All living things have an aversion to the undead. The stronger one's instincts, the greater those feelings are. The strong are compelled to strike them down because it is the right thing to do as living beings. As you say, the undead are the foes of all life. Fortunately, as lords, we have the ability to steel our people against fear and instill resolve. It is not much different than facing any other enemy, much depends on your personal state. Ranakshara nodded at his words. Saraka had paraphrased things greatly, and he could only hope that their own experience and lore would fill in for what was left unsaid. Sorry, I was out in the camps. What's going on? Rana Saj entered the hall, his fur damp with rain. His eyes narrowed a moment after glancing at the map. Just like that? He said. Just like that, Saraka replied. We're still in the middle of reorganizing our forces to fight these Death Knights, Rana Saj said. How much time do we have? That depends entirely on the undead, Saraka said and turned to the assembled lords. Whoever is commanding them seems a bit greedy, however. Greedy? It's just the general feeling that I get from what we know of them so far. The entire time, they've been trying to generate as much negative energy as possible. Those elder liches we saw just now are handling corpses like goods. That successful assault wasn't followed by a general rampage, the undead simply tightened the encirclement like a noose. The hunter is trying to squeeze every drop of dread out of us before sending in its minions for the kill. I'm not sure if that was meant to help us or scare us, Rana Saj muttered. Sorry, Saraka chuckled. That was probably a bit too melodramatic. What I mean to say is common sense to any lord that commands warriors in battle. We should be doing what the enemy does not want us to do. Face the enemy, not with fear and doubt, but with courage and confidence. To build up that confidence, we must fight. Fight and learn. That's one thing that often goes unstated when fighting the undead. The living learn much faster than any elder lich, and the vast majority of the undead never do. Certainty had to replace uncertainty. They had to start inflicting losses upon their foe. Though it was an army formed out of an unprecedented number of powerful undead, it was absurd to think that something like a Death Knight or Elder Lich could be so easily replaced once they were destroyed. Once Rolengork's forces learned how to fight them, the undead could be overwhelmed, and they would also know how to deal with any threats that arose from the Katza plains in the future. Report. A lap runner shouted as she came up the stairs. Our forces in the furthest northeast are under attack. What happened? Ranakjara asked. The undead came out of the river, the runner answered. Before we knew it, they cut off the villages where Clan Ujin's forces were stationed. Soraka's eyes went to the area being reported as the runner relayed what he knew. It sounded identical to the attack on the banks of the Rolengork. First one corner, now the other. What are they up to? Another worrisome question presented itself as he stared down at the map, which was whether there were multiple undead commanders present and not just some single will dominating them, as was characteristic for massed undead forces. The distance between the two corners wasn't impossible for a tireless undead being to cross in time to direct both offensives, but he couldn't quite picture an undead being scurrying back and forth like that. The more powerful they were, the prouder they became, and the more likely they were to delegate menial tasks such as trivial research or logistical concerns to their minions. We can't just let them take bites out of us like this, Ranakjara said. A counteroffensive should be conducted to make up for our losses and keep morale afloat. I don't disagree, Ranasaj said, but how do we start? They are just standing there presenting themselves as targets, but that in itself makes one wonder whether there is some scheme in play. I'd be more confident about slipping past all those gaps in their lines to flank them if we had some idea of what they're up to. Maybe it's just a blunder on their part? One of the other lords said. Soraka noted how they aren't accustomed to strategy and tactics like the living are. If that's the case, said another, we should make our actions count for as much as possible while we inform the undead of their errors. This is stupid, Ranakjara snorted. Is it possible for anyone to commit blunders like these? It may seem strange, Soraka said, but it's not unique to the undead. Every race has natural blind spots and holes in their thinking. The undead are shackled to the entropic nature of death. The living grow, change and evolve. Thinking and behaving like the living is not so simple a thing for the undead. Not that they care to. Still, assuming that the enemy is conveniently committing errors is. Report. An hour runner burst into the hall, the harbor, the river, it's terrible. The assembled lords waited expectantly. It's, just look. Soraka exchanged glances with Ranasaj before they followed the runner back down the stairwell and out of the keep. Mitra, Karawaki, and their escorts joined them in the corridor along the way. What's going on? Mitra yawned. I have no idea, Soraka replied. Something about the harbor and the river. Isn't Davy there? Karawaki said. His steps picked up. She probably was. The merchant's daughter had a merchant's habits, rising well before anyone else to catch the early markets and see that her goods were on their way. There wasn't anything like that for her in Eastwatch, but she was applying her expertise to help organize the logistics of Rolengork's clans. Warriors and hunters rushed past them on the way to the waterfront. Even after exiting the city's lower gates, however, he couldn't sense any signs of battle. There was only a tense uncertainty that filled the atmosphere. Over here. Soraka's ears swiveled toward Davy's voice. His wife was standing at the foot of one of the harbor's stone piers with 5 bodyguards. We were called out here, Soraka said, but we didn't get much of an explanation. I could see that, Davy said. I'm not sure if I could accurately describe it myself. It's something straight out of a horror story. He peered out into the darkness, but there was nothing to be seen and little else to sense but the currents of air and water. His steps took him out onto the pier as he tried to get away from the interference on the wharf. Help! A thin cry drifted over the water through the incessant sound of the rain. Help! Over here! Someone, help us! As the commotion behind him grew distant, more voices joined the first. Help! Someone do something! No! They're here, abandoned ship! Damn it! What's going on out there? The panicked cries stilled at the question Soraka cast out over the water. He leaned forward, ears straining for a reply. It's the undead. They're rare. Swim for it. Why isn't anyone doing anything? What the hell? Soraka turned to the crowd along the shore. Get some bonfires going. They can't see which way they're going. People scurried about looking for fuel to pile up. The city had a bit of lighting, but the downpour likely obscured it. Soraka scrutinized the features of Eastwatch in his memory. Kasturi, there's no way this city doesn't have something like a lighthouse. Take a few glade stalkers. Split up and find it. Jiraka, can you see anything at all? Not yet, the Inquisitor replied. So far, it just sounds like the undead are in the river sinking shipping. Why would they be so far out on the river, though? Eastwatch is the terminus of their transportation network for now. He couldn't imagine that they were just lost in the dark. Since they were being attacked by the undead, they should have been trying to get to shore as quickly as possible. The prow, no, the stern? Dash of a river barge appeared at the edge of his dark vision. As the rest of the vessel drifted into view, it became evident that it wasn't on a course to the pier. A handful of lups stood on the ship's deck, but they didn't seem to be doing much else. Hey! Soraka called out, the harbor's this way. We've lost control. Came the reply, the undead broke our rudder and paddle wheels. Get us a rope. Soraka called over his shoulder. We've got a ship adrift. A line of dock workers came forward, carrying a long mooring line between them. One of Soraka's glade stalkers came forward to make the throw. The sturdy rope went high into the air, landing across the leading end of the drifting vessel. Its crew immediately jumped to secure their lifeline and the workers on the pier started to pull them in. Several seconds later, a black blade surfaced from the water and cut the line. Seriously? Jiraka said. The barge, which was still drifting toward the pier, suddenly stopped. Its crew lost their footing, falling to the deck as they were pushed back out into the river. Karabaki. Summon Monster V. Nothing appeared when she cast the spell. Soraka assumed that she had summoned a water elemental. The crew of the barge fell over again as their ship abruptly reversed direction and headed back toward the pier. Nearby, the river started to churn. There's a death knight down there, Karabaki said. Can you beat it? Soraka asked. It shouldn't be a problem. The water's surface continued to churn as they awaited the unseen battle's conclusion. Death Knights were terrestrial combatants, and, while the undead didn't need to breathe, it didn't mean they were meant to fight underwater. Against a water elemental, it likely had no chance. Water arced into the air and the approaching barge split in half. Its crew went into the water with a shout of collective shock. Before he could say a word, the head of one of the crew members hurtled out of the water at him. Soraka and Jiraka ducked as it flew past and into parts unknown. You bastards! Ranasaj shouted, come out and fight like true warriors. The Bar Lord's challenge echoed over the water. That type of taunt only worked if the target noticed the user, however. What happened to the Death Knight? Soraka asked. Reinforcements, Karabaki shook its head. They withdrew. Even if we won, we can't cover the whole river with summons. Can we save our people, at least? Ranakshara asked. You saw what happened just now, Soraka said. They seem intent on running their little horror show here. Since they are, we could probably lure them into more fights, but it comes at a cost. The more mana we spend here, the less we have for when they attack in earnest. In other words, a diversion. An atrocious one, but something entirely expected of the undead. Soraka squinted as a flash of brilliant cerulean burst forth from Eastwatch's nearest battlement, sending a column of light lancing into the overcast sky. It was followed by another, and then another, forming the points of a triangle over the city. At the formation's center, from the pinnacle of Eastwatch's central keep, a fourth column of light, brighter and wider than the others, illuminated the land. Huh, Jiraka said. I didn't expect to see one of those here. What is it? Ranasaj asked. It's a light that the humans always use, one of the lords nearby said. It helps them at night more than it does us, so our mystics deactivated it when we conquered the city. It's more than that, Soraka said. It's a navigational beacon. For land, sea and air traffic. The beacon was a concept from an epoch lost to mortal memory, a world that was essentially alien from their own. That being said, they didn't fall out of use. The great ports of the world all used them, or at least an imitation of them. Rumor and fancy asserted that the real ones were driven by some unfathomable technology for equally unfathomable applications. That no one could figure out how they worked only served to encourage those lines of thinking. Whatever it is, Ranakshara said, I welcome it. The light seems to drive away the creeping darkness that the undead have brought with them. You sure about that? Jirika said. Ranakja turned to look at Jirika, who jerked his head toward the river. The beacon illuminated the Rolengork, and a veritable fleet of drifting river barges was now visible for all to see. Occasionally, a ship was broken apart and its screaming crew was dragged under. Those few closest to the shore that thought to swim to safety met identical fates. Soraka growled as the flame of hope ignited by the beacons was just as quickly quenched. A diversion the undead's actions might be, but he couldn't just leave it at that. "Karavaki," he said. "Let's do this again. Shall I call for the others?" "No. Bring in that barge over there before it gets too far." He pointed to a ship that was just crossing the line of the pier. Karavaki summoned another water elemental. "What's the plan?" Jirika said. Soraka opened his mouth to speak, then paused. He had intended to do it himself, but... Ranasaj. Get ready to taunt this next one. Ranasaj furrowed his brow in confusion, but he readied himself anyway. He cracked his neck and rolled his shoulders, sheathing and unsheathing his claws. The boat passing the pier a few hundred meters away suddenly stopped as if bumping into a submerged obstacle. It pivoted in place until its bow pointed toward the shore and swiftly glided in their direction. 20 meters away, it slowed down to line up with its prospective moorings. "Jump," Soraka told them. "But, do it," Ranasaj roared. Splashes followed one after the other as the crew jumped into the river. A second later, an undulating black blade hacked into the barge's hull. It stopped halfway and withdrew. "Karavaki. I got it." "How far?" "About 10 meters upriver." "Vortex it." A swirl of water formed nearby, growing into a surging whirlpool. The vortex swelled and rose above the river's surface, and a death knight suddenly shot up into the air. "You're mine," Ranasaj roared. The death knight topped out at about 10 meters over the water, where it hovered for a moment before flopping back into the water with a loud splash. Ranasaj exchanged awkward looks with Soraka. "I thought I got Iwo." Ranasaj twisted to the side as the point of the death knight's flambage exploded out of the water. An unearthly howl pierced the air as the rest of the death knight followed through with the thrust. Beastmen nearby backed away cautiously as Ranasaj faced off with the undead monstrosity. "I guess it did work," Ranasaj said as he stepped back from a vicious diagonal slash. The Overlord stepped back from the Death Knight's relentless assault, deftly dodging its hate-filled strikes. Shouts of encouragement rose from the beastmen as they passed. The fight advanced up the pier and onto the wharf. "Keep an eye on the water. If any other undead show up, knock their heads off." His bodyguard turned their attention to the river while Ranasaj's fight moved up the shore. A ring had formed around the two combatants and neither had appeared to make much progress against one another. The cheers of the spectators had only grown in intensity. "How old-fashioned," Jirika said. "It is," Soraka agreed, "but I don't dislike it." It was a society where an individual warrior's prestige and honor still meant something. Before a stage of advancement where they were replaced by cold calculation and duty in the name of sweeping institutional imperatives. What they witnessed now was something that usually only existed in flights of whimsy and fantastic tales. The Death Knight's flambage moved in a series of black blurs as the undead warrior tried to draw blood. Its motions abruptly ceased when Ranasaj finally decided to test one of its strikes with a parry. The undulating blade stopped against the Overlord's bracer. Ranasaj narrowed his eyes. He threw his arm out, sending the pulsing black weapon to the side. A vicious slash of his claws raked against the inside of his opponent's exposed arm. Sparks trailed in the attack's wake. With the force put into the strike, the Death Knight's return stroke came uncontested into Ranasaj's side. A deathly hush fell over the crowd. Ranasaj's chuckle rose over the steady patter of the rain. "Pathetic." His paw went down to grasp the black blade resting against his enchanted green dragon scale armor. "Pathetic," he laughed. "If all you can do is receive attacks, then you can never prevail against us." Ranasaj sent his gaze across the gathered warriors. "Tear this tortoise apart." As one, the crowd pounced. The Death Knight jerked to the side for a split second before Ranasaj drew its attention back to him again. Warriors of all of Rolengork's races set upon their foe, ripping, tearing and biting. The biting probably hurt. Eventually, pieces of black plate armor started coming off. Then, all at once, the Death Knight crumbled into pieces. Soraka looked out across the river, then up at the sky. As expected, cold, calculating, and single-minded, the undead held absolutely no qualms about discarding a liability. They knew neither love nor loyalty, friendship nor faith. That fact was not lost upon Rolengork's warriors, and he could feel their disgust for their enemy escalate all the more. They feed on your fear, Rana Saja's voice carried over the wharf. They desire your despair. They wish for your wails of grief and anguish. But this is all that they are. Rana Saja's foot came down to crush the pile of debris at his feet. This is all that they will ever be. Give them nothing that they want, remember everything that they have done. Let their atrocities fuel your righteous fury as you rend these abominations into dust. A tremendous roar shook the harbor and carried up through the pillars of light overhead. Soraka nodded in satisfaction. Now, they were ready to fight. Squads 4 and 5, pushed to meet with Raoul's advance. Squad 6, advance 1 kilometer straight ahead. Ludmilla observed silently as Olga directed her forces to isolate the salient forming from Raoul's river assault. The clamor of battle below rolled forward as the two spearheads cut deep into beastman-controlled territory, obliterating the warbands that thought to stand in their path. Most prudently did not, but that prudence served the Royal Army's purposes just as well. Within a half hour, the offensive resolved into a solid encirclement that isolated a 6-square-kilometer pocket of beastmen. Squads 2 and 3, Olga said, begin cleanup. Sergeants, make sure your forces don't get split up. Olga's gaze crossed to the southwest of the encirclement. There, the beastmen forces had drawn back from her thrust and were locked into a defensive posture by the threatening advance of Squad 6. The apprentice nodded once to herself before looking back at the pocket. Raoul's going to keep going, she said. Do you think so? Ludmilla asked. He's always like that, Captain, Olga answered. Once he figures out how to make something work, he tries to make it work more. Instead of withdrawing to the river to plan another assault, he's just going to cut straight across from where he is and make another pocket or something. Ludmilla's lips turned up in a slight smile as Olga issued orders in anticipation of Raoul's move. The evaluations of their league matches indicated as much, and she supposed that, as Raoul's only opponent for months, Olga would also understand this. The histories always spoke of famous commanders in a singularly brilliant light. Things like camaraderie, complementary personalities, and threads of a shared destiny were always attributed to the great captains of legend. Realistically, however, she thought it should also be the case for commanders, especially ones that were raised or trained together. In fact, the Imperial Army undeniably proved this to be the case, though they generally blurred the line between the two roles. Maybe we need some legends of our own to promote the officer corps of the Royal Army. It seemed more her friend's field. Maybe they would help if she asked. Captain, Raoul said as his skeletal dragon settled in beside them, I'd like to create a second pocket from here. You said we'd be able to do this twice before morning, but, with how slowly information gets around down there, doing it again right away should get us the same results. Ludmilla exchanged a grin with Olga before replying. How far do you plan on going? Ludmilla asked. About the same as before, he answered. That's as much as 4 squads can hold back anyway. Very well, she said. Let's see how far we can take this. Make sure you're doing it on both ends. Once each pocket is done, keep going and watch for any changes in the beastmen's behavior. Raoul's skeletal dragon banked away. Ludmilla wondered if he noticed that Olga had already prepared in advance for his proposal. 15 minutes later, she watched as the squads under her 2 apprentices worked in tandem to tighten the encirclement further. Their first attempt had taken roughly 3 hours. Things were steadily getting faster as both commanders and soldiers became accustomed to the maneuver. Continued success with this tactic should see us at the walls of Eastwatch by tonight, Psycho noted. I still doubt that will be the case, Ludmilla said. Does the General Staff have anything to say about our progress? There are currently no recommendations or amendments to our operations. Maybe any data was fine. As for their own studies, she was still conflicted over the notion that she was gathering wisps of negative energy like some sort of flying spindle. Lady Shiltir only spoke of it as a wonderful thing, but Ludmilla still wanted to ask the Sorcerer King about it. She wondered if it was appropriate to place personal questions into his suggestion box. One thing was certain, even without any answers from His Majesty, however. Using her license for atrocity was making Ludmilla stronger. That strength came in the sudden bursts that indicated that she had gained a racial class level. She didn't have time for thorough testing, never mind the development of anything new, but little things here and there could be noticed, as well. Her sensory perception, which had already been boosted to that of an adamantite ranger by her equipment, was getting even better. She didn't have to fly as low as before to observe the battlefield, which in turn offered her a greater field of view. Her ability to track had similarly improved, as had her natural insights as a ranger. That was something she wanted to keep Leanne from finding out, or she'd hear no end to her calling her a Death Ranger. Beyond that, ranger things weren't the only thing she was getting better at. The range of her voice of authority continued to grow, as was her ability at managing people or troops, implying that she was also growing as a commander, captain or noble. The effect that Tyra noticed in River Garden was probably some form of battlefield aura. It was all a bit strange, as Lord Mayor's continued work with the Adventurer Guild showed that level gains for humans didn't work that way. Back when she was still a human, growing stronger as a commander didn't improve her abilities as a ranger, though it was proven that she was some sort of noble fighter that improved as a commander, fighter and administrator. The last part was only a guess on her part, as the Adventurer Guild didn't measure administrative ability. At the same time, the only thing she could think of to explain it was what some had suggested, which was that she had become what she was. Her undead self was the concept of Ludmilla Zaradnik, or the noble commander ranger that Lady Shiltier and Lady Aura had decided she was about a year previous, all packaged into something called a revenant. Level-wise, a quick check proved that she now could reserve 5 focus levels for martial arts without harming herself. Studies from the Adventurer Guild pointed to warriors gaining 1 focus level every 5 warrior levels, and the increase in strength she had experienced after discovering this placed her total warrior levels at 26. As heteromorphs were much stronger than humanoids and demi-humans at what Lord Mayor considered low levels, that meant that she was also much stronger than her level suggested. Once she accounted for her equipment, she effectively ended up in the realm of heroes. Not that she felt very heroic overseeing an undead horde as it overran a whole country. Her new source of strength also served as an uncomfortable reminder of how inhuman she had become. Or just how undead she had become. Instead of a living thing that matured and grew in strength, she matured through a process similar to how elder liches were speculated to gain in power. Ludmilla didn't disagree with the notion that she might exist to regulate the generation of negative energy and thus make whatever necessary conflicts that the Sorceress Kingdom had to engage in clean, but something told her that being able to was no excuse to commit an endless string of atrocities. Knowing Lady Shiltier, she was heavily biased by her nature as a vampire when it came to her interpretation of Ludmilla feeding on negative energy. Consuming as much as one could was a good thing, from her point of view. I should really ask the Katzakabal about that at some point. There was a growing list of at some points that Ludmilla never had the time to get around to. Hopefully, the end of the Draconic Kingdom campaign and its residual tasks would leave her with some free time to take care of it. A flash of brilliant light came from the direction of Eastwatch, and she turned her head to find 4 bright columns rising from the city to illuminate the countryside. Olga, Raoul, withdraw into the clouds, now. Ludmilla rose alongside Olga's skeletal dragon. Raoul joined them a few minutes later. Even from their distance, the light was bright enough for humans to see at night with. What is that? Olga asked. I have no idea, Ludmilla answered. Psycho, do you know anything about this? This one has not been briefed on any such phenomena, Captain, the Elder Lich replied. Queries from the sergeants are being submitted. Your orders? Have them maintain their defensive stance, for now. The squads on offensive maneuvers are to continue what they're doing. Analyze servitor performance and identify any debilitating effects against the undead. She turned her attention to Psycho, who was turning its open hand in front of its skeletal face. Revenants were immune to turning, holy water and other similar effects, so she wouldn't be able to feel anything of the sort. The life essence and mana essence enchantments from her ear clip didn't indicate any damage or mana loss. How are you feeling, Psycho? No debilitating effects have been identified, the Elder Lich told her. What were your concerns? It was just unexpected, I suppose. Usually, light is attributed with anti-undead properties. Maybe we're outside the effective radius of whatever it does. Did any of the squads on interdiction duty say anything? Those squads were operating within a few kilometers of the city, so if the light did do something, they would be the ones most likely subjected to its effects. There have been no. Psycho cut itself off. Ludmilla frowned. Correction, the Elder Lich said. Squad 26 has lost one Death Knight. What? Raoul nearly shouted. Squad 26 has lost one Death Knight. That's not what I meant. Do they know what happened? Ludmilla asked. Shortly before the appearance of the light, Psycho said, Squad 26 encountered resistance near the harbor. Attempts were made to recover one of the disabled vessels. An engagement with an unknown assailant ensued. An unknown assailant in the water. A water elemental? One of a few possibilities, Psycho said. The engagement was inconclusive and the squad withdrew after destroying the vessel and taking the crew. Fighting an elemental in its native element was generally a bad idea, as it conferred tremendous advantages to the elemental. A water elemental in the water was just as invisible as an air elemental flying around in the sky. The Death Series servitors weren't suited for underwater combat, either. They were fine for destroying helpless vessels and dealing with next to helpless beastmen in the water, but there hadn't been any precedent established in regards to aquatic combat from what had happened so far. What happened after that? Once the light appeared, another attempt at retrieving a different vessel was made. One of the Death Knights was thrown out of the water and into the air. After returning to the water, it went to attack an individual on the shore and was destroyed. Analysis suggests that a taunt was used while the Death Knight was in the air. It sounds like it got vortexed out of the water, Raoul said. That ability is annoying in league matches if a unit gets caught. Was any attempt made to recover the Death Knight? Ludmilla asked. No, Psycho said. The taunts that the local beastmen use can be maintained indefinitely and our forces do not possess the means to free taunted servitors from the effect. Furthermore, the effects of the light were unknown and there was a substantial number of beastmen on the wharf. The sergeant of Squad 26 decided that too many risks were present and chose to abandon the servitor. Though Psycho was only presenting the facts of the matter, Ludmilla still felt like it was her fault in some way. The leaders of the opposing army had the means to free their subordinates from taunt effects, yet the Sorceress Kingdom's royal army did not. As a captain who was supposed to be leading on the front lines, she hadn't the slightest idea how it was achieved. How has it affected our interdiction efforts? Ludmilla asked. The appropriate adjustments have been made, Psycho answered. Vessels drifting downriver have had their courses altered in advance so they come no closer than 300 meters to shore. Those undergoing retrieval will not be challenged inside of known taunt ranges. And if they have a better taunt, we'll find out, was the unspoken implication. Ludmilla knew how they saw things as summoned servitors, but she still didn't like how they seemed to see their expendability as something to be taken advantage of in every conceivable situation. They were intelligent beings who could have lives very long ones, at that, and Ludmilla felt that they should develop a sense of appreciation for their existence. Were any vessels conveying humans discovered? None, thus far. Since the entire purpose of crippling the vessels was to keep the Draconic Kingdom's citizens from being shipped off to the jungle, it didn't actually matter whether the beastmen made it to shore or not. Their ships were damaged and they were ultimately stuck. Any repairs made would simply be undone on the way out again. The General Staff made an exercise out of it anyway. I'm making an amendment to the original interdiction order, Ludmilla said. Since they appear to be keeping the Draconic Kingdom's citizens around Eastwatch, we'll allow inbound traffic to reach the city. The more supplies reach the beastmen, the less of a chance any humans will be eaten. The General Staff would probably be happy to have more test subjects, as well. Olga and Raoul had gone through tens of thousands of beastmen already and they appeared to be well on their way to shrinking the encirclement by a third, so the arrival of additional forces didn't seem so imminently threatening anymore. Captain, Psycho said, 1 hour remains until the scheduled meeting. Ludmilla checked her clock. The light from Eastwatch had obscured the advance of the dawn. Continue your current offensive, she told Olga and Raoul. You may drop back below the cloud cover, but make sure you stay at least 2 kilometers back from the front lines. If you manage to get your forces to meet in the middle, don't initiate any new offensives to shrink the encirclement any further. Raoul may continue to conduct trades, but stay aware of the disposition and general attitude of the beastman forces. We don't want a mass panic that may bring harm to the Draconic Kingdom's citizens. What if they attack us, Captain? Olga asked. Then defend, Ludmilla answered. Hold the line, but we have room for a bit of flexibility now. Raoul's forces remain a threat even if they attack, so any of their offensives should be conducted with that in mind. Rolengork's commanders are highly competent within the bounds of what they have available to them, so it's a good opportunity to learn from experienced opponents. I'm not going too far, so I'll be on hand if anything major happens. Psycho, have the reserve forces shift forward to within 500 meters of the new front line. That should make everything seem much more substantial to the Beastmen. She left her apprentices to their tasks, ascending to eventually surface above the clouds. The light emanating from Eastwatch similarly pierced through, continuing upward into heaven's sparkling field. Despite the task at hand, Ludmilla's thoughts strayed at the sight. She idly wondered if the light led those who followed it to some other place, or beckoned for others to come from beyond. Shall we dispatch an investigation team, Captain? Psycho asked. Let's see if anyone knows about this before we decide to send any undead into the light, Ludmilla answered. They re-entered the clouds, descending rapidly to a small hill overlooking the Oraculon. Ludmilla circled the area as she decelerated, searching for any beastmen that might have evaded detection. Once she was satisfied with her findings, she alighted beside an ancient cypress crowning the hill. Oh, it looks like Psycho's still in one piece. Tyra appeared with the sound of her voice. The Grand Master of Igania was leaning against the tree, arms crossed over her midriff. Have you seen anything like it before? Ludmilla asked. Nope, Tyra answered. I figured the beastmen slapped together some big ritual to help deal with the undead. Does something like that exist? Yeah, the ninja replied, but they're not as flashy, as far as I know. The most commonly known one is Hallow, you know, that thing that makes temples and holy sites seem sanctified or whatever. I guess it's not common in Riastais and the Empire since it's a 5th-tier spell and they don't use ritual magic, but places that do use ritual magic use it everywhere that their temples see fit. Are there any examples of the spell in the Draconic Kingdom? The Temple of Storms. If I have it right, Crystal Tear's cleric was one of theirs, so they had a 5th-tier caster available to maintain the enchantment on their urban facilities across the country. Across the country? Ludmilla frowned as she reached into her infinite haversack. That sounds like a lot of work. Not really, Tyra shrugged. Hallow lasts for a year, so she could have just taken care of it while her team was going around the country doing jobs. It's kinda weird, people in this region make magic out to be both more and less complicated than it actually is at the same time. Magic casters play along with it, too, or maybe they want it to be seen the way it is so they get paid more or something. Did that mean that she was paying the casters working in her companies too much? Then again, it probably didn't matter since the rates were made to be competitive with the rest of the region. Lowering them because they were too much didn't matter if everywhere else didn't think the same. Ludmilla produced a preservation container filled with food prepared in Corin on the lake. Tyra straightened from the tree, rubbing her hands together in anticipation. I've been waiting for this, she grinned. A job with fresh, hot meals delivered to agents on the field. I couldn't have imagined it just a few months ago. Just so you know, this food is actually PSSTHT. Tyra held up her index fingers in front of her. Don't ruin it. It's all about the feeling. The experience. Ludmilla smiled and rolled her eyes. After a moment's thought, she brought out a folding table and chair, setting them up in a dry, flat spot under the tree. She placed a pure white tablecloth atop it and set out utensils before presenting the meal. Breakfast is served, my lady. She swept her hand out in a polite bow. Yeah, that's more like it. Tyra settled into her seat. You know, I've posed as a maid on jobs before, but never as a noble. Posing as a maid sounds difficult, Ludmilla said. Something like the scullery or a hall girl's pretty easy. A position on the senior staff's impossible. Even if you somehow get in, you still need the practical qualifications for the post. But aren't you technically something like a noble? Ludmilla asked. Lady Tyra of House Igania. If something like a noble commander ranger could exist, then surely a noble ninja could. Technically, Tyra answered. My upbringing's different, though. Sort of like how martial nobles are different from the softer variety. Then there's the whole live in the shadows and die in the shadows thing. That was out of necessity as an assassin organization, yes? Now that you're a part of the Sorceress Kingdom, you should operate within the framework of its laws. Your people may work in the shadows, but there's no need for them to stay there when they're not. You'll collect mold. MMH, being a noble sounds like a pain, though. All of the politics and pageantry, not that the pageantry part doesn't sound fun once in a while. My take on it would be that Ijarnia would be a martial house of a different variety from mine, Ludmilla said. I hardly care about politics outside of my duties and people rarely bother me about it. To be honest, after seeing how the Draconic Kingdom functions, I think it would be to the Sorceress Kingdom's benefit to have a loyal house that has a high degree of familiarity and involvement with what some would consider the shadier parts of society. It's a role that Ijarnia would fill eminently well, and you're already doing it anyway as members of the Intelligence Division. A House of Shadows. Florine would probably latch onto the concept and turn it into something if she already hadn't after seeing the Draconic Kingdom's families. For Ludmilla's part, she thought it would be nice if she wasn't the only one that the other nobles were wary of. I guess it's worth considering, at least, Tyra said. Now you got me thinking about the Founder's legacy and having kids and all that. You don't want a family? Oh, I do. I really want one. Having 4 or 5 little ninjas running around terrorizing the world would be great. But having a family seems a lot scarier to me than being an assassin. If I may ask, Ludmilla said, how does it work for Ijarnia? The common sense way, Tyra replied. There are a bunch of branch families descended from the Founder. The strongest member of those branches is the heir to Ijarnia, the Grand Master. People seek out the strongest partners that they can reasonably get together with. I'm no exception. Do you have anyone in mind? There are a few kinda maybes, but no one that's a clear yes yet. Speaking of which, how much do you know about Moman? That knobby sticks to him like glue, but maybe I can borrow him for a bit. What? You aiming for him, too? Almost every woman, some of the men, and a bunch of the demi-humans in Irantal see him as a desirable partner, but no. Also, I consider myself Nobbe's friend, so I can't in good conscience assist you in your venture. I see. Oh, looks like our guest of honor has arrived. It took Ludmilla several moments to spot the barge coming from downriver. Evidently, Tyra's detection was superior to hers even with the equipment bestowed upon Ludmilla by His Majesty. Tyra, Ludmilla asked, do you have any equipment that aids with detection? Nope, Tyra replied. Barely anyone can beat me in stealth and detection without any of that. Dragons and other crazy things don't count. Figured it'd be better to use items that helped with other aspects of work. Ludmilla detached the cowl from her mantle, holding it out toward Tyra. Perform another check of the surroundings using this. Make sure our guest has a safe path from their landing. The ninja used a trooper's towel before taking the cowl in hand. She put it on and peered at the approaching vessel. Ooh, I can count all the buttons on Lord Tien's shirt now. I always wondered how your detection was so good despite being a noble. It improves general stealth ability as well, Ludmilla said. That explains that part, too. Maybe having something like this isn't such a bad idea now that I've got a way to carry extra gear around. Tyra dashed off, completely vanishing at 20 meters. Ludmilla cleaned up the table, putting away the remains of the ninja's breakfast. She left the table and chair where they were just in case Queen Auriculus needed them. Tyra returned just before the Queen arrived. Find anything? Ludmilla asked. Not a soul. Tyra removed the cowl and handed it back to her. The Queen's looking pretty ominous, though. Queen Auriculus came into view, walking up the trail on the western side of the hill with Lord Tien at her shoulder. She was in the same dark garb as Ludmilla had last seen her in, and her demeanor was relatively unchanged from that time. Your Majesty, Ludmilla nodded in greeting. Lord Tien. Lord Tien nodded in reply, but his eyes quickly left her to sweep over the landscape. Queen Auriculus cupped her chin in hand, leaning forward as she peered at Tyra. Have we seen you somewhere before? I don't think so. Your Majesty, Ludmilla said, this is a scion of Ijarnia, Queen Auriculus said. We remember now. Over 2 generations ago, your ancestor appeared in our chambers to market your organization's services. You bear a striking resemblance to her. Market? Well, I guess it was around the time when we were still getting our name out there. It pleases us to once again meet one of Ijania's line. Yours is a cherished heritage, and we hope you'll do everything you can to see that it endures. Tyra didn't seem to have anything to say in reply, but she shot Ludmilla a suspicious look. A coincidence, Ludmilla said. A coincidence? Queen Auriculus tilted her head curiously. We were just talking about family, Ludmilla replied. That probably seems strange in these circumstances. Not at all, the Queen said. It is not strange for one's thoughts to turn to family on the battlefield. I suppose I'm the strange one, then. Her thoughts rarely strayed from her duties. When they did, it wasn't for long. Ludmilla cleared her throat. Tyra and her subordinates participated in the liberation of Helama and Fallujah. After that, they infiltrated occupied territory to gather information. Tyra is the one that first discovered that Lyra was being used on your subjects. With our eastward advance, Ijania has switched to ensuring that liberated villages, towns and cities are completely free of beastmen. You have our utmost gratitude for your role in the liberation of the Draconic Kingdom, Queen Auriculus said. Will you be staying to help with security? Nah, I gotta get back to work. Nice meeting you, though. With that, Tyra vanished into her shadow. Queen Auriculus cast a bemused look at the spot where the ninja once stood. Her ancestor did that as well, she said. We suppose some things never change. Did she really market Ijania's services? Ludmilla asked. Something like that, the Queen smiled at some distant memory. She popped up in our chambers and seemed shocked to discover that the Queen was but a child. Then she tried to impress us with all sorts of tricks while looking extraordinarily guilty all the while. We felt so bad for her that we never hired them. We do believe that good people make the best assassins, however. In many ways, we admire them. They understand the difference between can and should, and they are willing to do all of the necessary things that most good people would balk at. May I let Tyra know that Your Majesty said so? Of course. She might even need it at some point. Now, how are things in Eastwatch? Ludmilla turned her attention to the fields around the city. As you can see, Your Majesty, actually, what is that? A great big magic light. She stared at the Queen. The Queen stared back. Her lip twitched. Don't tell us that you thought it was some sort of anti-undead weapon? Yes, Your Majesty. The royal army of the Sorceress Kingdom, held back by magical lighting. Queen Auriculus let out a laugh. The gloom that seemed to shroud her lifted for a moment. We suppose you wouldn't have seen one before, she said. It is a navigational beacon, a waypoint for traffic, so to speak. But why is it so bright? It seems like overkill for river traffic. Because their function demands it, Queen Auriculus said. Decades ago, a much more fanciful Queen Auriculus added it to Eastwatch. We had hoped to bring in travelers from afar. With it, we optimistically thought, would come prosperity and succor against the beastmen. What kind of travelers would something like this bring? Other dragonlords. The vast air fleets of a mighty merchant empire. Valiant sky pirates. Visitors from the moon or perhaps beyond. The Queen plopped herself down on the chair made available with decidedly less than queenly grace. In the end, she sighed, no one came. As a consolation, it helps the people around here see at night. We never gave up, though. No more than our people would give up. We kept improving things through endless setbacks, hoping that, one day, visitors would come and see that our home was worth investing in. Well, Ludmilla looked up at the column of light, that effort may still very well pay off. That is our hope, Queen Auriculus said, but time and experience have proven that there are certain things that I alone must do.